we obviously can't dissect every single technique that is used to manipulate and game Wikipedia, but we do want to delve into the specifics of how some of them take place, the most important ones take place, because they are actually representative of the broader tactics of how the establishment in the United States is controlling the flow of information, including things like inventing the disinformation industry, the industry full of people with fake credentials who declare themselves disinformation experts, who purport to decree what is true and false in order to get what they declare to be false censored off the internet on the grounds that nobody needs false information. But before we delve into the specific tactics, we want to just show you a couple of examples on both sides. People who are enemies of the establishment and people who are aligned with the establishment, to see how glaringly disparate their treatment is. So there is a page devoted to the scandal of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden in Ukraine. The title of this article on the scandal, remember, this is supposed to be an ideology-free, neutral encyclopedia, is The Biden-Ukraine Conspiracy Theory. There is a mountain of evidence showing that Hunter Biden was paid $80,000 a month, not by Burisma executives because they were stupid, but because they were smart. Of course they were getting something in value for that $80,000 a month, and they were getting a lot in value in the way of access to Joe Biden, who took all sorts of steps to benefit Burisma or give Burisma the impression that they were having access to the most important official in Ukraine, who happened to be Joe Biden. And yet, according to this encyclopedia article, this evidence doesn't exist. This is just a complete conspiracy theory. So the very first paragraph of this encyclopedia entry on the Biden-Ukraine, quote, conspiracy theory reads as follows. The Biden-Ukraine conspiracy theory is a series of false allegations. So right away in the first sentence, they're announcing that this whole scandal is fake, that victimizes Joe Biden. The Biden-Ukraine conspiracy theory is a series of false allegations that Joe Biden, while he was vice president of the United States, engaged in corrupt activities relating to his son Hunter Biden, who was on the board of the Ukrainian gas company Burisma. As part of efforts by Donald Trump and his campaign in the Trump-Ukraine scandal, which led to Trump's first impeachment. So go back there. So notice, the Biden-Ukraine scandal is, according to Wikipedia, the Biden-Ukraine conspiracy theory. But the Trump controversy involving Ukraine is the Trump-Ukraine scandal. Everything is written to completely comport with the liberal worldview and the Democratic Party talking points. I mean, it's amazing. This is one of the most important controversies in our politics. And this is written exactly the way that if you gave the keys to Wikipedia to the DNC, they would write it. It would read no different. As part of efforts by Donald Trump and his campaign in the Trump-Ukraine scandal, which led to Trump's first impeachment, these falsehoods were spread in an attempt to damage Joe Biden's reputation and damage his chances during the 2020 presidential campaign. The conspiracy theory alleges that then Vice President Biden withheld loan guarantees to pressure Ukraine into firing a prosecutor to prevent a corruption investigation into Burisma and to protect his son. U.S. intelligence community analysts released in March 2021 found that proxies of Russian intelligence promoted and laundered misleading or unsubstantiated narratives about the Bidens, quote, to U.S. media organizations, U.S. officials, and prominent U.S. individuals, including some close to former President Trump and his administration. Can it be more blatant than that? Not only is it a false conspiracy theory, but it's one that the Russians were behind and was done to victimize poor President Biden and to sabotage his election chances. Just even the tone doesn't bother to pretend. This is the site that is being heavily financed and promoted by Google as the authoritative source of what is true and not about the world. And it reads like it's a monologue from the Rachel Maddow show. Every page does. Here is an article on the controversy, the ongoing controversy over the origin of COVID. And this article is entitled The COVID-19 Lab Leak Theory. And here's what this encyclopedia has to say about the hypothesis that the COVID virus emerged not as the result of natural occurrences in the animal world that had a zoonotic origin and leaped to human species, but instead appeared in Wuhan because it leaked from the lab in Wuhan that was doing exactly the kind of research on bat viruses, coronaviruses, that made them more contagious to humans. Quote, this is Wikipedia. The COVID-19 lab leak theory, or lab leak hypothesis, is the idea that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that caused the COVID-19 pandemic, is the result of a laboratory leak. The theory is highly controversial. Most scientists believe the virus spilled into human population through zoonosis, similar to the SARS-CoV-1 and MERS-CoV outbreaks, and consistent with other pandemics in human history. Available evidence suggests that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was originally harbored by bats and spread to humans from infected wild animals, functioning as an intermediate host at the Hunan seafood market in Wuhan, Hubei, China, in December 2019. Several candidate animal species have been identified as potential intermediate hosts. There is no evidence SARS-CoV-2 existed in any laboratory prior to the pandemic. The idea that the virus was released from a laboratory, accidentally or deliberately, appeared early in the pandemic. It gained popularity in the United States through promotion by conservative personalities in early 2020, fomenting tensions between the US and China. Scientists and media outlets widely dismissed it as a conspiracy theory. Let me tell you a fact, an absolute indisputable fact. The view of the leading scientists in the US Department of Energy, as well as the FBI, is that the most likely explanation for how the COVID pandemic emerged is through the research that was being conducted, funded by the United States, and being conducted in the Wuhan lab. You would have no idea that that was true from this Wikipedia entry on one of the most important questions of at least the last decade, which is where the COVID pandemic came from. Every word is designed to suggest that only right-wing conspiracy theorists and liars would invest any plausibility in the possibility that the lab came from a leak and not from, that the virus came from a leak and not from of a lab and not from a naturally occurring event. Even though we know for certain that the top virologists and epidemiologists in the world, writing to Dr. Fauci at the start of the pandemic, were adamant that the evidence made it almost impossible to believe that it was naturally occurring and that the evidence was overwhelming, that instead it was consistent with manipulation in a lab. And there's an entire scandal about whether those scientists then deliberately signed a letter they themselves didn't believe under the direction of Dr. Fauci, who was desperate to ensure that programs that he funded and scientists in general wasn't blamed for the pandemic, but instead we believe the theory that the Chinese have such filthy and primitive and unsanitary eating practices that it came from their wet markets. Now, I'm not going to suggest that there's definitive proof one way or the other. Having looked at all the evidence, and we've done many shows on this, I concur with the lead scientist at the Department of Energy that the evidence is far more convincing that it came from a lab rather than naturally occurring. So I wouldn't mind at all if the Wikipedia page reflected that debate, that uncertainty, but it doesn't. It sneers at the notion that it could have come from the Wuhan lab and insinuates that it's only right-wing liars trying to create a war with China who would possibly believe that, and that it's been dismissed as a conspiracy theory. It's exactly what if you asked an MSNBC personality to comment on, if you asked Joy Reid to comment on the COVID pandemic, that's exactly what she would tell you, word for word, exactly what was in this entry. And that's true of almost every entry. I just can't overstate how, I mean, it shocked me when I began looking at this over the last 6 months to a year, how blatant it has become. Now, let me show you what happens if you are an enemy of the liberal establishment. So let's take a look at one of the prime enemies of the liberal establishment right now because he's running in the Democratic primary against Joe Biden, and he's questioning the war in Ukraine and the censorship regime and, of course, COVID orthodoxies. Pretty much the triple derby of things that are most important for the establishment, he is a dissident on. And he has been polling too high for their comfort. He bears the Kennedy name. He has access to a lot of money. And therefore, he's one of the leading enemies of the liberal establishment. So if you wanted to find out about RFK Jr., by going to Google, you would immediately be directed to his Wikipedia page. And here's what you would immediately read. There you see Robert F. Kennedy Jr. The first page reads the following. RFK Jr., Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., born January 17, 1954, also known by his initials RFK Jr., is an American environmental lawyer, politician, and writer. So they made it through one sentence without didactic and polemical slanting. But then this is what they say in the next sentence. He is known for promoting anti-vaccine misinformation and public health-related conspiracy theories. He is a candidate for the Democratic Party nomination in the 2024 presidential election. Since 2005, he has promoted the scientifically discredited claim of a link between vaccines and autism, and is founder and chairman of the Children's Health Defense and Anti-Vaccine Advocacy Group. Since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Kennedy has emerged as a leading proponent of COVID-19 vaccine misinformation in the United States. That's from the first paragraph. He's a purveyor of disinformation. He's known as a liar. He's a conspiracy theorist. That is the site that Google has purposely convinced Americans to believe is authoritative and to which they direct them. Now, if you take a look at somebody who is a proven conspiracy theorist, but who is an ally of the liberal establishment, such as David Frum, who is one of the most dishonest purveyors of disinformation in the country. He was George Bush's speechwriter following 9/11, disseminated all kinds of falsehoods, the ultimate conspiracy theory of our generation, the most destructive one, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that they were in an axis of evil with Iran and North Korea, even though they were dedicated enemies of Iran, that they were in alliance with Osama bin Laden, suggesting that Iraq was responsible for the 9/11 attack, that Iraq was behind the anthrax attacks. We covered that on a show recently. And by the way, I just want to confirm that we do have Larry Sanger here, which I'm delighted about, and we're going to get to him in just a second. I just want to walk through these couple of examples. We'll talk to him about the ways in which this manipulation is accomplished, and then we will go back to the evidence of how it's done. But let me just show you a couple of more of these illustrative examples. So David Frum is an actual conspiracy theorist whose conspiracy theories and lies have resulted in the death of at least 1 million people. You would expect, right, that if Wikipedia is willing to take these strong stance like they do with RFK Jr. and call a conspiracy theorist and a liar, a conspiracy theorist and a liar in the first paragraph, of all people, you would expect to find that in David Frum's Wikipedia page. And yet the term conspiracy theory does not appear in David Frum's Wikipedia page, because David Frum is an ally of the liberal establishment and one of the most vocal opponents of Donald Trump. It just doesn't appear, except for one sentence that mentions that David Frum opposed conspiracy theories being spread about President Obama. So the only mention of a conspiracy theory or a conspiracy theorist in David Frum's entire lengthy Wikipedia page is to mention or cast or depict him as an opponent of them. So here you see the beginning part of his Wikipedia page. Imagine the impression, the difference in impression that these deliberately create as opposed to the RFK Jr. one. David Frum, David Jeffrey Frum, born June 1960, is a Canadian-American political commentator and a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush, who is currently a senior editor at The Atlantic as well as an MSNBC contributor. In 2003, Frum authored the first book about Bush's presidency written by a former member of the administration. He has taken credit for the famous phrase, axis of evil, in Bush's 2002 State of the Union address. Notice not a critique about that phrase. It depicts Frum as this historic neutral figure, neutrally describing what he did in his career. In 2009, Frum denounced various anti-Obama conspiracy theories as, quote, wild accusations and the paranoid delusions coming from the fever swamps. Frum supported the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Again, no mention of the conspiracy theories behind that war that justified the war, that ushered it in, that he helped spread. Just a neutral assertion that he supported the invasion of Iraq. He helped write George W. Bush's famous Axis of Evil speech to describe the governments of Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Frum is a supporter of Israel. He opposed President Barack Obama's Iran nuclear deal. Let's take a look at one more example. Jeffrey Goldberg, who is the current editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, who probably did more than any single American to convince Americans of the outright lie, the classic conspiracy theory, that Saddam Hussein was in an alliance with Osama bin Laden when he was a reporter at The New Yorker. And that was a vital lie to convince Americans of, because after 9/11, Americans were willing to support a war if they were convinced they were going to war against the people who perpetrated this horrific attack on American soil. Even if they had convinced Americans Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons or biological weapons, which David Frum and Jeffrey Goldberg both attempted to do, that would be insufficient to generate the support necessary without misleading Americans into believing that Saddam Hussein had an alliance with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. It was Jeffrey Goldberg who took the lead in spreading that lie, that disinformation, that conspiracy theory. And if you look at his Wikipedia page, there is a mention that that theory has been debunked because it quotes my saying so. But it's way buried down in the Wikipedia page. I mean, if you're not willing to spend 20 minutes reading Jeffrey Goldberg's Wikipedia page and just want to find out quickly who he is, and you read the first section, you would think he's a journalist of great stature. There's no hint of criticism of him in the first passage of his Wikipedia page, let alone the heaping of invective the way you find with RFK Jr. and other enemies of the liberal establishment. Jeffrey Mark Goldberg, born September 22nd, 1965, is an American journalist and the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine. During his 9 years at The Atlantic, prior to becoming editor, Goldberg became known for his coverage of foreign affairs. How august. Michael Massing, an editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, called Goldberg, quote, the most influential journalist blogger on matters related to Israel. And David Rothkopf, former editor and CEO of the FP Group, called him, quote, one of the most incisive, respected foreign policy journalists around. He has been described by critics as a liberal, a Zionist, and a critic of Israel. The New York Times reported that he, quote, shaped the Atlantic's endorsement of Hillary Clinton in the 2016 United States presidential election, only the third endorsement in the magazine's 160-year history. Now, you have to go very far down Goldberg's Wikipedia page, I mean, near the bottom, to find one of the only criticisms of him. In 2002, Goldberg's The Great Terror, published in The New Yorker, argued that the threat posed to America by Saddam Hussein was significant, discussing the possible connections between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. The Saddam Al-Qaeda conspiracy theory has been debunked. It also discussed the Iraqi nuclear program, averring that there was, quote, some debate among arms control experts about exactly when Saddam will have nuclear capabilities, but there is no disagreement that Iraq, if unchecked, will have them soon. There is little doubt what Saddam might do with an atomic bomb or with his stocks of biological and chemical weapons. Glenn Greenwald called Goldberg, quote, one of the leading media cheerleaders for the attack on Iraq, saying Goldberg had, quote, compiled a record of humiliating falsehood dissemination in the run-up to the war that rivaled Judy Miller's both in terms of recklessness and destructive impact. In his 2008 article in Slate titled, quote, How Did I Get Iraq Wrong?, Goldberg explained why he initially supported the Iraq War and wrote that he, quote, didn't realize how incompetent the Bush administration could be. I mean, in comparison to what Jeffrey Goldberg said and did, I mean, here's just one article that actually won magazine awards at the time. From March of 2002, so shortly after the 9/11 attack, when his friend David Frum was having George Bush accuse Iraq of being behind the anthrax attack and being in league with Al-Qaeda and being in an alliance with Iran and North Korea. Here you see Jeffrey Goldberg in the New Yorker, arguably the most influential journal for American liberals. And obviously the support of American liberals were vital to get that war started so that Democratic senators like Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, Joe Biden could support it. And they succeeded in doing that. At the time of the Iraq War and 6 months later, 70% of Americans, 70%, believed the falsehood that Saddam Hussein was in league with al-Qaeda. And it was Jeffrey Goldberg who did more than any other journalist to ensure that they did. Here you see in March of 2002, his now notorious article, The Great Terror in Northern Iraq. There is new evidence of Saddam Hussein's genocidal war on the Kurds and of his possible ties to al-Qaeda. Now, David Frum doesn't have, even at the end of the article the way Goldberg does, any mention that he ever spread disinformation. Even though throughout RFK's entry and the entry on the lab leak theory and the scandal involving Joe Biden and Ukraine, it instantly denounces it as a debunked conspiracy theory full of lies. David Frum has no criticisms in his because he is an ally of the establishment, not an enemy of it. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.